teachers at Reddit, what is the strangest thing a child has brought in for show and tell? A kid brought in their grandfather. Not to talk. Just to sit there. I had a student bring in a cow eye. Then a few years later his brother brought in a goat heart. Hands off parenting. In kindergarten, I had a friend who was wearing a sweater with a bunch of farm animals on it. When it was her turn for show and tell, she stood up and pointed to her sweater. My teacher immediately said, "You can't use the clothes you're wearing for show and tell." And my friend looked at her pointedly, lifted the mouth of the cow on the sweater and pressed a button. The cow mooed. The class applauded. In 3rd grade, I brought a dead baby mole I had accidentally stepped on the night before. My teacher made me stand outside until my mom came to pick it up. He didn't have show and tell either. I just brought it. In kindergarten I brought in a penny and I said, "This is my penny. If I hold it, it gets warm. But if I leave it somewhere it gets cold. Dot. And tomorrow, I'll show you what happens when I swallow it." Not a teacher. But I brought in my auntie's pet tarantula's exoskeleton. Fun times were had that day. Edit. I just remembered walking round the corridors with it in my hand telling everyone I passed that I just found it in the playground. Had one 1st grader boldly stand in front of the class and tell about the time she ran through a sliding glass door. She whipped her dress over her head and showed the class the scars of the hundreds and hundreds of stitches she had to have done at the hospital. Funniest kid I ever had in class. Drove the other teachers nuts, but I thought she was awesome. On a field trip to the Natural History Museum, the docent stood by life-sized models of a T-Rex and Triceratops. The little girl in my class waved her hand wildly. Oh. Guess what? There's a dog bigger than those near my grandmother's house. The docent politely said, "Little girl, dogs never grow to be that large." And that 6-year-old replied, "Lady, have you ever even been to my grandmother's house?" Plot twist. Her grandmother lived next door to Clifford. I brought a dead copperhead, venomous snake, to school that I found on the side of the road when I was 6. What you meant to say was I lived in the South. Edit. I was the worst at show and tell as a kid. I don't think I really grasped the concept. Highlights. The mostly decomposed carcass bones of a dead cat that I found under the house. Much to the horror of both the teacher and my parents. I just thought it was interesting. A recipe for making carrot juice that I insisted on reading aloud in painstaking detail. I was a weird child. Edit. A recipe. For carrot juice. Ingredient 1. Carrots. Step 1. Juice the carrots. A girl in 1st grade once brought in some eggs from her farm that were ready to hatch, along with some form of heating lamp. It took until the next day, but they finally did. All except one. When asked why that one egg didn't hatch, the teacher didn't know how to respond. But the girl's father, the farmer, flat out told us, well, that their chick is dead. Which caused roughly 70% of the class to start weeping. One kid was so upset he threw his lunchbox against the wall. The cheap plastic latch gave way and his lunch fell to the ground with a thud. And his can of Yoo-hoo burst as it hit the floor. The crying ceased almost immediately and was replaced with laughter. I like to imagine it was just funny that his drink exploded. But it was more likely that we were a bunch of jerks who thought it was hilarious that this kid wasn't going to eat lunch that day. Wait. What was the question? I used to have a pond in my backyard that toads used as a breeding ground. So one day I took a huge bucket of tadpoles in for show and tell. I even brought in a diagram of how they grow. One kid offered 10 cents to buy one. I don't know what caused me to demand 25 cents. But from then on I made close to $40 from all the kids trying to buy frogs from me. Her asshole hamster. Julius. It bit me when I tried to put it back in its little cage and then ran off and shat everywhere. Couldn't find it again all day. Her dad shows up to pick her up at the close of the school day and is thrilled the hamster is lost because he hates it. He's going on about what a dick the hamster is when he suddenly yelps because the stupid furball crawled into his pants and bit his legs while we were talking. Taught 2nd grade in the ghetto years ago. Student brought in a double-headed DLDO. When I was in kindergarten, I thought it would be cool to bring my pony. So I did. I walked my Shetland pony from my house to school and was the coolest kid in class for a day. In grade 4, I brought in an empty hornet's nest from my grandparents' house for show and tell. Amazingly, they did not hatch until after I had done my little presentation and then left it on the nature table where all the other nature themed show and tell items from the week were. After the first 2 hatched, the teacher put the nest in a jar. And 6 more came out. My uncle has a story about the time a buddy of his brought a beehive into show and tell. This was wintertime in Alaska. So the hive was pretty much frozen and everyone thought his was empty. After about 1 hour. In the nice, warm classroom, the hive thawed enough to wake up. Many a brick was shat. TL. DR ice makes a great fuse. I brought in my Mormon mother's garments. It seemed like a good idea at the time. As a Mormon, that is probably the funniest and most sacrilegious thing I've ever heard. When I was in elementary school, a kid brought his own record player to school and proceeded to play My Ding-a-Ling by Chuck Berry for show and tell. When I was in elementary school, a kid in my class brought in a grenade. Not a live one, mind you, but a grenade nonetheless. It didn't really surprise anyone because he was always the weird kid in school. Brick. Where'd you get a hand grenade? Not a teacher. But I work at a school and am frequently in kindergarten classrooms. This happened in September. I'm in this one junior kindergarten classroom, think barely 4-year-olds, working on a computer while the class is doing their show and share thing. The kids are showing their stuff. Really happy to have me there so I can make a big deal over their toys. When one boy gets up and has his hands behind his back. He's shy and a bit solemn. So the teacher has everyone quiet down and she asks this kid what he brought in. Everyone is super silent, watching wide-eyed as he brings out a tiny little ceramic jar that has a glued-on lid. He says he brought in his daddy. Kid F King brought in some of his dead dad's ashes. Did he bring enough for everyone? A friend of mine brought a BB gun and a katana. Not a teacher, but this is burned in my memory. When I was in elementary school, a kid brought in an antique, old, empty bottle of scotch. When my teacher saw the glass alcohol bottle, she immediately snatched it up and told the boy he could not use the bottle for show and tell. It was too dangerous. The boy then began to cry hysterically. He was proud of that bottle and didn't understand what he did wrong. It was raw. Apparently his grandpa had just died and he always drank that particular brand of scotch, and this kid associated that bottle with his grandpa. Art's question just made me remember one of my first emotional reactions to something. I dropped a surfboard on my foot when I was younger. And the nail blacked and fell off. I brought my toenail in for show and tell. In 1st grade, my boyfriend brought in his dead pet rabbit that his cat had eaten a huge chunk out of and proceeded to do CPR on it. My teacher screamed "Suiwaru" loudly. In year 1, brought in my Game Boy and Pokemon Yellow. Then proceeded to play the game with the screen facing the kids, hoping they would see. I did this for about 2 minutes before my teacher picked me up and brought me back to my seat. When I was in kindergarten, I loved vacuums. One week we were assigned the letter D and my mom had recently bought a Dyson. So guess what I brought in? I showed the kids in the class how it worked by vacuuming the classroom for 20 minutes. Not a teacher, but funny story. My brother brought me in for show and tell. I was 3 weeks old. In 1st grade we had 26 kids. So we were assigned a letter and we had to bring in something that started with that letter. Of course I got U. My mom and I searched the house for something that started with a U and couldn't think of anything good. I hated dolls. I was a teddy bear girl, so I didn't have any. But my mother had an incredibly creepy 1950s male doll with chipping, probably lead, paint and a missing nose and a hand permanently molded into a jacking off O shape that rested perfectly over his crotch. I introduced it to everyone as an uncle because it reminded me of my Uncle Pat, my only uncle. It probably creeped the hell out of everyone, especially the teacher. I often wonder why it didn't occur to either me or my mother to bring in an umbrella. I had a 4th grader bring in the blood of Christ from church the day before, accompanied by a beautiful half English half Spanish explanation of how Jesus died for our sins and how lucky we are to all be Catholics. I do not work at a Catholic school. Another girl quietly said that she was not, in fact, Catholic. That's okay, said the presenter. You're Chinese. Student here. I brought in a dead bat once. No joke. What's even worse is that it died because it was on the ground outside and my dad had accidentally stepped on it. Without shoes. Now that I look back on it, my kindergarten teacher handled it very well. I had it in a Tupperware container and stressed the importance of using gloves to handle the corpses of animals. And washing your hands just to be safe. All while reciting interesting facts about bats I knew from David Attenborough documentaries. Now that I remember. In 1st grade I also brought in 3 baby birds I had snatched from a nest, while keeping them in a sock in a jar. Strangely enough, they took the baby birds away. But no one stopped me with my dead bat. And my teacher told my parents she was impressed with my presentation. I was a strange kid. Beer. A 2nd grader brought a bottle of beer, unopened, and said that it was his daddy's favorite drink. He said I'm not allowed to have some yet, but I can't wait to drink it like he does. When she was young and attending a Catholic girls' school, my mom decided that she should ask my grandfather, a doctor, for something to bring in to show and tell. He gave her a human brain, presumably from a cadaver or something. He put it in a little lunch sack and sent her to school where she promptly plopped it down on the nun's desk to show off with pride. The nun, curious as to what was in this oddly wet sack, peered inside, screamed, and fainted on the spot. Coincidentally, that was the last year she went to SIT school. I brought my cat in once for show and tell. Little did I know the teacher was highly allergic. She, the teacher, was hiding in a closet in the back of the room with a tissue covering her face and she was turning red and coughing like crazy all while insisting I continue with my presentation. In 1st grade I had a crush on the kid who would fart for show and tell. One time in kindergarten, it was show and tell and I realized I hadn't brought anything. Not wanting to be embarrassed, I thought of something cool I had on me I could show. I was wearing this little lacy pink bralette thing, like lingerie for 5-year-olds. And while I was waiting for my turn I wriggled it out from under my shirt and I got up and showed it. The teacher was sitting right next to me and didn't notice. Why were you wearing a bralette thing in the first place? I was in grade 4 or 5 and a kid brought in a taxidermied dog. When I was younger I was a little sociopathic. In grade 6 I brought in the most important thing to me, a jar containing my father's ashes. Only my dad wasn't dead. Actually he picked me up from school that day. Needless to say, I spent a lot of time with the school therapist and I'm 80% sure it played a large role in my parents splitting up a year later. Well, that got dark kind of fast. In kindergarten my grandpa was my show and tell. He was a paleontologist and brought in something that looked like a rock, along with a few other things, but we're just focusing on this rock. He instructed us to rub it on our face or on our arms. We were 5 years old so we didn't question him. After we were all done, he told us it was dinosaur poop. The class erupted into shrieks that could be heard by the other classes. And the principal came down to check on us. The teacher then told the principal to feel the rock. I never remember hearing so many laughs. I had show and tell once in primary school. Half my class forgot to bring something. Anyways, when the first person that didn't have anything with him came up, he just presented Mike. Different classmate. And the following classmate also presented Mike. And the one after that. And the one after that one. Arthur Jekyll, FCK me if that's spelled right, once brought in a tarnished silver baby mug, a sock, and a tube of cheap dollar store toothpaste. We all goggled at him, perplexed and fascinated. In our second grade classroom, he proceeds to glop white, minty paste all over this mug and rub it in with the sock. At this point, it sounds entirely creepy. It wasn't. Just confusing. Then, suddenly, holy crap. The mug is clean, shiny, new, like it just came from the silversmiths. Cheap toothpaste is great silver polish. I still clean my jewelry with it. TL. DR toothpaste bucket cleans family heirlooms. A kid in my class brought in the cremated remains of his cat when we were in second grade and dropped them everywhere. In kindergarten, I brought in my baby sister, who was a month old at the time. A trick was to sit in my lap while I showed everyone how babies can't touch their hands together over their heads because their heads are too big. It ended with one of my friends calling me a liar because my head is bigger than the baby's head and I can't touch my hands together over my head. I knew a kid that brought construction paper and ate it. I'm not a teacher and I wasn't when it happened either. I worked as a director at an outdoors camp for kids for 4 years. During my final year there, this 5-year-old girl brought in a syringe for show and tell. She forgot to mention that her father was a doctor, lol. I sent my kid to show and tell with an EMF reader. One of the kids freaked out, thinking that the class was now haunted. Fun with special education. Back when I was a toddler, I wanted to bring my mom into show and tell to show off her scars when she got her pancreas removed. A boy once brought a tiny suited goblin-style creature into my class. While within its vicinity I was completely paralyzed and could only hear white noise when it opened its mouth. The children appeared transfixed on it, laughing and dancing in unison as I just stood there helpless. Sounds like a Furby. I personally brought in my puppy in 4th grade. No. What you brought in was happiness.